Hello, and thank you for joining us for this event, which is tied to the Legion Life in the Roman Army exhibition that we currently have on at the British Museum. I am at slightly last minute chairing this event, even though I'm one of the speakers, because sadly Carolina Rangel de Lima is not well. She would have been chairing the event. She's the project curator of this exhibition. So I've taken over chair. So that's the first thing to let you know. The second thing to let you know is that we're going to have three speakers. I'm going to start, and they're going to be followed by two other speakers. And then what we then will have is that, well, we're all speaking for roughly 10 to 15 minutes. And at the end, we'll have the opportunity for some Q&A. So as we go along, think of some questions, and if you can put those in the Q&A section of your chat, then at the end we will address those questions that have arisen during the talks. So just to explain a bit who I am, I'm Richard Hobbs. As I said, I'm the senior curator of the Romano-British collections at the British Museum, and I'm going to be the first speaker today. I'm going to be followed by Dr Emma Southon, who's a Roman historian. Her most recent book is A History of the Roman Empire in 21 Women, but she's also the author of three other books on Roman history and the co-host of the history comedy podcast, History is Sexy. And our final speaker today is Professor David Mattingly, who is Professor of Roman Archaeology at the University of Leicester and author of many books and articles about the Roman Empire. He is well known for taking a somewhat post-colonial view of the impacts of the empire on its subject populations, as is especially evident in his book An Imperial Possession, Britain in the Roman Empire, published in 2006, and Between Sahara and Sea, Africa and the Roman Empire, that came out last year. David remains fascinated by the Roman army, but is skeptical of some of the benefits it is commonly claimed that it brought to provincial communities. So I shall be starting with my talk, which is entitled The Vindolanda Tablets, Romans and Britons. So I just want to give you some brief background about Vindolanda before I get into the kind of meat of things with the tablets themselves. The Vindolanda, this slide shows the fort at Vindolanda, and it's basically one of the best, certainly the best excavated Roman fort in Britain. It's been excavated over the last 50 years, and it's been estimated that there's about another 150 years of archaeology to excavate. But basically, the excavations have revealed a series of forts at the same site, kind of all sitting on top of each other, as you can see in this slide. You'll also notice a garrison settlement which sits outside the fort. And just so you know where the fort lies, it lies on the so-called Staingate Road, which was the former the northern frontier of Britain up until around about AD 100-ish. It was then replaced as the frontier by Hadrian's Wall built around 20 years later. But Vindolanda continued to be an important fort in that fort system, which controlled movement across the border between the lands that lay to the north of the wall and the areas to the south. Now, Vindolanda is most famous for its tablets. These were found first in the early 1970s by Robin Burley, who's shown in this picture here. Robin famously said on the discovery of the first tablets, very deep down in the archaeology, in these waterlogged deposits, he said, if I have to spend the rest of my life working in dirty, wet trenches, I doubt whether I shall ever again experience the shock and excitement I felt at my first glimpse of ink hieroglyphs on tiny scraps of wood. And indeed, the first tablet was this one, which rather famously refers to underpants. But what the important point to make here is that this type of writing tablet, which is ink written on thin slivers of wood, wasn't really known before the discovery of these tablets in the early 70s. So they were a real revelation about the way in which communication and record keeping was done in the Roman army. And the tablets mostly date to a period when the fort was occupied by two different sets of auxiliary units. The Tungrians at first, who were then replaced by the Batavians. Both of these come from the Low Country regions. And as you can see from this slide, there's various phases of occupation in that early period where they kind of switch places at various points. And the tablets are very useful explaining how that worked to us. So in my talk, I want to talk really about what the tablets tell us about those relationships between the army at Vindolanda and the local Britons. And really the first point to make is that the tablets give us very little evidence actually on the subject of the acculturation of the native Britons. There are basically only two texts which mention Britons directly. The first is the so-called intelligence report. And as you can see here, this very interesting tablet says the Britons are unprotected by armour. There are very many cavalry. The cavalry do not use swords, nor do the wretched Britons mount in order to throw javelins. And I just highlighted that word, wretched Britons. You might also translate it as little Britons. It's basically Britunculi. And obviously that is a very disparaging way in which to mention the local Britons. Also, it's worth saying that this is the only time that this phrase, Britunculi, is mentioned in the epigraphic sources. Now, we don't actually know the purpose of this tablet, what it's quite for. Some think it might be a note left by the commander Cerialis, by Verecundus, the one that preceded him, the fort commander, to give him some sense of what he would be dealing with. Alternatively, it might be an assessment of the suitability of the locals as recruits. Now, the only other text that mentions Britons directly concerns the transport of grain. We can speculate that the carts, which are mentioned in this tablet, may have been requisitioned by the army, and we cannot know if the payments in silver denarii mentioned here were actually paid. As you can see, there's mention of paying 1 denarius each, basically on the carriage money and so on and so forth. So it's basically about payments about the transport of grain. The Roman army was known to abuse its power, since there are a number of examples of edicts from across the empire, including one in both Latin and Greek from Pisidia in Turkey, that provide clear instructions on how locals should be paid for the use of their animals and transport. Clearly, such edicts would not have been necessary if the army and state officials hadn't been abusing their power and not paying locals or requisitioning things more than was agreed. And those two tablets are essentially all we have. So the other relationships with local Britons only come by inference from names and context. And I know that my colleague David Mattingly is also going to be talking about this tablet, but this is another very interesting tablet. I'll read out some of it to you. And as you can see, this is generally described as a letter of appeal, and it says that he beat me all the more, something about pouring goods down the drain, as befits an honest man. I implore your majesty, this is an important phrase, not to allow me, an innocent man, to have been beaten with rods, and so on and so forth. And then he basically goes on to say that he tried to make complaints to various officers about his treatment. He refers himself later in the tablet as a man from overseas and an innocent one. Now, what's interesting about this particular tablet is a number of things. Obviously, it's about redress for maltreatment. But what's interesting is that it's actually written on the back of a wheat account. So it seems highly likely that this man was a civilian trader. Now, although he describes himself as a man from overseas, he may have settled locally, having moved from overseas. So in that sense, he may have been a local man. The interesting use of this term, Your Majesty, has been interpreted as an appeal to the provincial governor for redress. There have been one or two claims that it was actually an appeal to the Emperor Hadrian on his visit to Britain, but I don't think there's really much likelihood that that's the case. It's much more likely to be the provincial governor that this man is appealing to. So both this and the previous tablet I showed, where it's possible that the Britons were not being paid for grain, this one suggesting brutal treatment, do not exactly paint a very rosy picture of relations between the Roman army and the local Britons. So moving on to this tablet, this is a rather different type of tablet, and is perhaps puts the Roman army in a slightly more positive light. This is a letter of recommendation. In this letter to the prefect Cerialis from a certain Carus, who's probably a fellow officer, he invites Cerialis to offer patronage to a certain Brigionis, and in turn to pass Brigionis onto the notice of a more powerful figure called Annius Questor, who is the legionary Centurio Regionaris at Carlisle, which is nearby. Now, Questor may have been the most powerful officer in the region, and he may well have been in charge of the census, which was essential for raising taxes. So a huge responsibility. Brigionis, on the other hand, is clearly of a more humble status and not necessarily even a soldier. The name is Gallic or Celtic, given a Latin termination, and so he may be, we can't be sure, but he may be a native Briton. So what this tablet might give us is a glimpse into how locals were absorbed into the system. And in this case, a relatively ordinary man is being recommended to someone very senior, which does give us some sense of social mobility for some people. Now, this tablet is equally intriguing, but for different reasons. Here, one Curtius Super, writing to Cassius Sulpicia, asks him, so that you may explain, and so that they may get from you barley as commercial goods. Another reference to the trading in barley or wheat. Now, the interesting word here is the one highlighted, the Latin word interpreteris. Now, Cerialis might be being asked to act as a go-between, but the verb is only really used in that sense of verbal or written communication. As written by the paleographers who have worked on the tablet, and I quote from them, we should presumably not rule out the possibility, however, that he is being asked or instructed to act as an interpreter in some transaction with non-native speakers. In that case, the implication would be that military personnel are selling barley to the natives. This clearly is an interesting idea and reminds us that the Roman army would often have had to rely on interpreters to undertake transactions, and such people would have presumably been well treated. You're not going to mistreat someone who's going to help you with transactions, and presumably also reimbursed in some way. It should be added that the name of the slave Candidus is a common one, and it is not thought to imply that he was a local man. Sorry, I mean Cassius, not Candidus. Now, finally, is this tablet. Now, this isn't directly related to relationships between Britons and Romans as such, but it is nonetheless highly intriguing. Now, the letter was originally thought to be from one slave to another, and I shall read it out for you. To you, Severus to his Candidus, greetings. Regarding the something for the Saturnalia, I ask you, brother, to see to them at a price of 4 or 6 asses and radishes to the value of not less than half a denarius. Farewell, brother. Now, this is when it becomes quite interesting, because originally, as I said, the reading done by the paleographers was to Candidus slava genialis, the prefect from Severus, slave of. So that's why it was felt to be from one slave to another. That's now been reread as Corniclarius. Now that's very interesting because a Corniclarius was a relatively low-ranking military officer. But nonetheless, despite being an officer, he twice calls Candidus brother. Now, this is a very strange use of a word between an officer and a slave, and doesn't really make a lot of sense. Now, that either means that they had a very close relationship, in which case he would use such a term. It may, and this is slightly stretching things, relate to the fact that the Saturnali was the one time a year that slaves were treated more as equals, and in fact would actually be kind of completely given the day off because the masters had to serve their slaves, although how much that actually happened in reality we don't know. But the point is that the Saturnali was a very important festival for enslaved persons. So this tablet is really intriguing from that sense. And then just finally, I wanted to just say that there is some other evidence as well for the way in which local Britons were treated. It's not just the tablets. These two skulls were found in the Severian period ditch at Vindolanda. I'm not going to talk about these skulls because David is going to talk about these in his talk. But I just wanted to make the point that it isn't just the tablets that give us these type of insights, few as they are. There is other evidence that we can start to build in order to better understand those relationships. And of course, I am just talking about Vindolanda. There are, of course, other sites and other material culture evidence that can help us understand. So just to conclude, it is possible to use the evidence from Vindolanda to explore relations between the occupying army and the local Britons. The evidence is not extensive, but as my examples have shown, in all cases, the relationship was exploitative in one way or the other. But that is the nature of empire, and Rome is no different to others in that regard. And just before I hand over to Emma, I just wanted to mention that in addition to the Legion Roman Army exhibition, I do hope you might, when you're next in the museum, to make a trip to Gallery 49 where the Vindolanda tablets are on display. And the reason why I say that is because we've literally just re-displayed the tablets in a new way. We're using some video in the gallery and also some sound. And I'd really be interested to see what visitors make of our new way in which we're displaying the tablets. And I think at that point, I think I've stuck quite well to time. I shall hand over to Emma, who is going to give our next talk. Over to you, Emma.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so I, if this works, there we go. So I am going to talk about one of the collections of letters that have come out of the Vindolanda discoveries and the tablets, which are thankfully conveniently have been contextualized by Richard. So I don't have to do that bit. I'm going to be specifically talking about the letters and documents that relate to Sulpicia Lepidina and her family, and the network of fairly elite kind of Roman citizens that you see across that military zone in northern Britain. The letters that we see from Sulpicia all come from the third phase, and so they're all from a period where the Batavian cohort are there, and they are unexpectedly very extensive in the information that they give us about what kind of details of life as an elite Roman citizen who lives on the northern military zone, and they are surprisingly very, very comfortable. I'm going to describe them a little bit. I'm hitting my laptop there, which is unhelpful. These are the letters that I'm going to talk about. This is from the exhibition, the Legion exhibition itself, beautifully arranged, and you can see how fantastically preserved they are and how much information they contain just in each individual one. The most famous of these is by far this one, which is the birthday party invitation. It reads like this: Claudia Severa to her Lepidina, greetings. On the 3rd day before the Ides of September, sister, for the day of celebration of my birthday, I give you a warm invitation to make sure that you are come to us to make your day more enjoyable for me by your arrival if you are present. Give my greetings to your Cerialis, my alias and my little son send their greetings. And then written in a secondary text, it says, I shall expect you, sister. Farewell, sister, my dearest soul, as I hope to prosper and hail. I am always continually fascinated and delighted by how incredibly affectionate these letters are between these two women, who presumably their primary connection is that their husbands have broadly the same job. But it is an invite to a birthday party occurring between two people and their families on this northern military zone inside a fort. It's sent by Claudia Severa, who we find out from later texts is from Briga. We're not entirely sure where Briga is, but obviously it is somewhere within that region. And you can see that there is this social world that exists on this northern this kind of border military region, this incredibly affectionate relationship between two families who are sending love backwards and forwards to one another. And we can see that they are developing kind of familial and social relationships. And from the handwriting, we can also see that Claudia has a scribe, an enslaved person that she is dictating her letters to, because the bottom part is written in a handwriting that is much less professional, shall we say, written by somebody who writes significantly less than the person who wrote the main text. We have in total 4 letters which go backwards and forwards between Sulpicia, Lepidina and other women in the region. 3 of them are between her and Claudia. This is the second one, which is the next longest one, and talks about Claudia asking her husband if she can have permission to visit Vindolanda, whether she can. They talk about other letters that they have been sending back and forth. She said, you'll receive my letters, and they talk about the fact that they have this kind of going backwards and forwards, and this ongoing relationship of visiting, of sending letters, of sending people backwards and forwards across the military zone, very comfortably, very happily moving around. The third letter is just a tiny little fragment that it just basically recognized the handwriting. And the fourth letter then introduces a further person, expanding out the social zone a little bit more, to introduce somebody who may or may not be called Paterna, but who is clearly of a lower social status, because she calls Lepidina Domina, kind of means mistress, and kind of brings this idea of women sharing remedies between one another. Somebody is ill, possibly there is a remedy being sent, another remedy for something else. And these all reveal and hint at a kind of wide network of women and families across the zone, who are, with a surprising amount of comfort and security, moving across the zone, talking to one another, sending each other, sending presents backwards and forwards around. Other documents from the layer of Lepidina's occupation of Vindolanda further expand on things that they brought with them, and things that filled the life that they had. And when you imagine the Roman army, it is always presented as a particularly Spartan and miserable place to live, a Roman fort. They're very rarely presented as somewhere delightful when you watch films like Eagle of the Ninth or whatever. But from these documents, we can see that Sulpicia and Cerialis brought with them things like various different kinds of robes, including special robes for dining, purple and crimson curtains, jewelry. They have tunics, which are sent as a present from Briga. They have bronze vases and bowls. They have all kinds of items that denote this wealth and luxury of being a Roman citizen of high status, their equestrian status, and demonstrate this they were bringing with them not just Roman power in terms of the military strength of the Romans, but also Roman power in the sense of wealth and excess and demonstrative consumption that made their lives look unbelievably cozy and aspirational in comparison to a life outside of the Roman Empire. Combined with the other lists that we have, which include lists of food bought and sold, lists of particular foods brought in for feasts at things like Matronalia and the Saturnalia, and you begin to see that part of the display of Roman power in this military zone was not just sending out patrols of men on horses with swords, but also showing the amount of consumption and amount of money they had and that purchasing power as well. And finally, we also have these letters between Cerialis and Brocchus, who is Claudia's husband, where they talk about hunting. In particular, they regularly refer to their own social lives and activities. At one point, and this is one of my top one favorites, Brocchus and another friend send Cerialis a letter wishing him good luck meeting the provincial governor, which I find to be delightfully human. But they also talk about their social lives between them. And one of the things that they do is hunting. In this letter here, Flavius is asking Brocchus to send him some new hunting nets. And they were also some left behind. Hunting nets are used to catch boar particularly, but they are obviously going out and about outside of the fort, living social upper class lives. Like hunting is something that Roman upper class people do to really show off that they can effectively to dominate the space around them in a way that is technically not allowed because it's kind of illegal, but they do it anyway as a sign of domination. And altogether, these letters come together to reveal this whole network of spaces. These are just the people that we know from basically one letter. We can tell that there are at least 2 families with children, with enslaved attendants, with ridiculously luxurious lives lived in a Roman fort. We have from the bonus letters the notion that they are moving backwards and forwards across the countryside, dressed very beautifully, dressed very powerfully, with an astonishing amount of comfort and security and lack of fear, which really, I think, shows their total domination of the space and their total comfort in the space. They are totally comfortable in their role as the only power within this militarized zone. They have basically no fear that they are going to be hurt or that anybody is going to be hurt, or that anything bad is going to happen to them as they move around. And this is part of what the native Britons are going to be seeing. People moving around luxuriously in a space that they now feel that they own almost completely. I don't actually know how long I was talking for there, but hopefully that was about the right amount of time. And I will now pass over to David to discuss in much more detail.
Emma, thank you very much. That was well within time. So don't worry too much, as you actually had a few minutes left, but that's fine. I'm sure that will allow us for more time for questions at the end. So yes, David, if you could now do your presentation, and then we shall move on to the Q&A session.
Yeah, can we get my slides up? Okay, great. Well, hello, everybody. The starting point for my comments was my visit to the British Museum Legion exhibition in April. This is a sumptuous exhibit, as I'm sure many of you will have seen the exhibition and will know for yourselves. It's got an extraordinary range of objects relating to life in the Roman army. And I particularly like the life course approach to the exhibition that takes the visitor through the many stages of a military career, from recruitment to retirement and death. But by no means all soldiers made it to discharge, of course. The combination of rich material paraphernalia and textual evidence shapes a compelling story. Overall, the exhibition is visually stunning, intellectually rewarding, and I'm sure that most visitors leave feeling that they've enhanced their knowledge about this important institution. But there's been quite a bit of discussion about the macho focus of the exhibition and its attendant promotion. Some female delegates, for instance, at the Roman Archaeology Conference in April, were quite outraged at aspects of this. There are also many cartoons, dress-up opportunities and games spread through the galleries, which look rather tacked on to the museum's design concept. As far as I can see, this material is an attempt to make the show more interesting for children. The problem that I see here, though, is that such material deproblematizes and trivializes the Roman army. It makes light of the fact that the Roman army was deeply implicated in the empire's record of killing, enslaving, and dominating people. The exhibition rather assumes that visitors will associate with the Roman army as our boys and be indulgent of the more toxic aspects of military life and behavior. Some visitors may feel that the women associated with the army or encountering soldiers are given poor consideration. And people who have less positive views of colonialism, for instance, from families that have been negatively impacted by modern colonial projects, may feel uncomfortable with some aspects of the tone of the exhibition. So my aim today is to ask you to review your own starting assumptions about the Roman army. To start with, what was the army for? The common view is that the army primarily killed barbarian enemies of the empire in order to protect grateful provincial populations who were happy, of course, to live under the Roman peace. Soldiers are still sometimes presented as great ambassadors of Rome, aiding the spread of Roman culture in the provinces in a process that's often described as Romanization. I shall try to demonstrate that these ideas are simplistic and quite problematic. If we look at the evidence more carefully, it's pretty clear that the primary purpose of the army was to serve the ruling emperor, and if he turned out to be no good, to find a better one. The army enabled emperors, of course, to raise taxes and to exploit the resources needed to sustain the empire. At times, especially if a militarily inexperienced man like Claudius became emperor, a campaign might be launched against an external enemy. As time went on, though, attacks on the empire from external enemies did increase, but for much of the Principate, the main focus was on internal security, the constant watch for pretenders, the suppressing of resistance and revolts. Far from leading cultural change for provincial populations, I would suggest that the army's use of material culture and elite behaviors was often directed at maintaining a degree of difference and distance between themselves and civilians. Territorial occupation and domination of peoples within the empire were at the heart of its business. By any reckoning, the Roman army was responsible for the killing of millions of people, enslaving millions of others, and enacting repressive supervision on millions more. The Romans weren't coy about what colonial wars involved. Our literary texts are full of colourful detail and some big numbers, and public artworks openly celebrate the collateral damage such wars inflicted on civilian communities: massacres, rapes, firing of villages, seizure of property, enslaving people, or forcing them to flee as refugees. The idea that the army was stationed along the empire's frontiers, primarily to fight off external barbarians, is one that's strongly implanted in Roman army studies. And there certainly seems to be some truth in this if you look at the great river frontiers of Rhine and Danube in Europe. However, in many other provinces, the garrison pattern is both less linear and much deeper across provincial territory. Note, for instance, the provinces on the map where internal security seems to have been as important as external threats: Britain, Dacia to the north of the Danube, Syria and Judea in the Levant, Egypt, Tripolitania, Numidia and Mauritania in Africa, and northern Lusitania in the Iberian Peninsula. Britain is a particular case in point because of the density of Roman troops that were stationed here. Around 12% of the total armed forces of the empire were based on 4% of the overall imperial territory. As the maps here show, the garrison was spread across a large part of provincial territory, not concentrated at the border, and these regional troop concentrations were maintained across many centuries. This must have had profound consequences for the local populations close to military bases. Recent research on the Roman army has highlighted just how distinctive its material culture use and identity presentation was. The civilians who lived in the garrison settlements alongside the forts included soldiers' families, veterans, so-called camp followers, artisans and traders, whose livelihood depended on the army. To a considerable extent, these people shared a sense of identity with the soldiers, forming a military community that was distinct from the surrounding rural communities of Britons. The cultural alignment with Rome that we see there is by no means typical of the region as a whole. Even then, some of the non-enlisted members of the military community were vulnerable to ill treatment. We've heard quite a lot about the Vindolanda tablets today, and I can't resist revisiting this fragmentary document to give you my take on it. It appears, as we've heard, to be an appeal for justice to a senior Roman official by a foreign trader who feels he has been unfairly treated by a centurion at Vindolanda. Some sort of altercation evidently took place, ending with goods being poured down a drain and the man being beaten. The subliminal message he's trying to convey here, though, is, hey, I'm one of you. I'm one of this military community. I'm not a local troublemaker from round here. I'm a foreigner like you. I speak and write Latin. I serve the military community, and I have been unjustly picked on. Unfortunately for him, it's also apparent that the other centurions have closed ranks, and the commanding officers conveniently declared himself ill. But if someone close to the military community was vulnerable to this sort of arbitrary abuse, we can imagine how much worse things potentially were for less privileged British people living near forts. Violence was always latent in dealings between the army and civilians, but potentially more extreme and more easily triggered in dealings with people who were seen as lying outside the military community. So my second example, also from Vindolanda, concerns that one of the skulls found in the Severan fort ditch. And here I'm grateful to Andy Burley for provision of the details and the illustration of the skull from a still unpublished article. The man had been killed with severe, perhaps exemplary violence, with multiple wounds to his skull, any one of which could have been fatal. After death, he was decapitated and his head was placed on a stake, presumably set by the fort ditch into which the skull eventually fell. Roman soldiers were known to sometimes go in for this sort of headhunting behavior, as in the famous tombstone of Insus from Lancaster. But it's possible from the level of violence inflicted on this man and the display of his head, that he was someone who had led resistance to Rome, whether in a revolt or attempted incursion. Isotopic analysis of the surviving teeth suggests that the man had lived locally in southwest Scotland or Cumbria. However, the aDNA analysis reveals that he also had Italian ancestry, and it seems likely that this Briton therefore had a Roman father and a local mother. The circumstances of their sexual contact are unknowable, of course, but it seems quite possible that we're looking here at a non-consensual relationship. Whatever the exact story, it looks to me very much like a complex colonial situation. To return finally to the point about Roman frontiers not necessarily being the best concept for thinking about the Roman garrison, I want to discuss Hadrian's Wall. The traditional view is that the wall separated Romans from barbarians, inside from outside of the empire, with a scholarly narrative framed in a way that encourages readers to associate themselves with Rome rather than with the local British. However, the wall didn't mark the frontier. There are multiple outpost forts to the north to show that Roman territory continued in that direction for some distance. There's also the matter of the vallum, constructed just to the south of the wall line, with both the wall and the vallum containing controlled crossing points on either side of a military cordon sanitaire that runs from sea to sea. The wall thus faces both north and south and seeks to control people in both directions. And I prefer to think of this as a deep security zone with Roman garrisons supervising communities on both sides and strictly controlling movement through it. We might reflect on the experience of those British communities to either side of the wall and what freedom of movement and life was like under Roman domination. Passing through a mile castle may well have involved considerable delays, needing the right documentation, being questioned, the potential for violence or insulting behavior being directed at one. economic extortion that went beyond what the army was technically allowed to levy. One can imagine the different treatment that awaited individuals depending on their precise relationship with the military community, or their membership of more or less favoured local rural population groups. The inherent power inequalities and the military paranoia of such border situations that turn every local into a potential threat will have also promoted transgressive acts on the part of soldiers. Indeed, there's plenty of evidence from other parts of empire, as Richard mentioned, of soldiers being accused of brutality, unwarranted violence and extortion against provincials. And it's much easier, I think, to understand the implications of this if we replace the idea of frontiers with security zones. I hope. So I just lost my last slide. I hope my slides and my remarks have complicated your view of the Roman army. Many people still assume that the army operated for the benefit of its common people and its internal impact was largely benign. I think we need to take a more skeptical view and try to consider the experience of the people who lived under military supervision. We know a vast amount about the Roman army and the soldiers serving in it. The army was the empire's largest and most important institution, but it behoves us to think more carefully about what this institution was ultimately for, what it did, and how it shaped the lives and experiences of civilian populations. Thank you. I noticed I got my prison bars came across me about midway through my presentation there, rather typically, but you can see the sun is shining in Leicester today. Thank you.
Indeed, Dave, I can see those prison bars. Thank you. That was terrific, and thanks also to Emma for her presentation. So we are really doing very well for time. We will have some time for some questions. So I'm going to start going through those pretty much in order that they've been received. So let me just go back up and find the first one. So we have a question from Esther, which is directed at me. And the question is, how complete are the Vindolanda tablets and what material are they written on? So yes, I won't go into this in great detail because we have I actually did a blog fairly recently on the BM website, which gives you lots of information about the tablets. And so I think my colleague Vicky is going to post that link in the chat so you can have a look at yourselves. But just briefly, the tablets there's roughly 1,800 tablets that have survived. Most are very thin slivers of wood, only a few millimeters thick, a bit like veneers. And they're made of different types of local woods, for example, willow and birch, and they're written on with ink, which is made from charcoal, basically. It's charcoal-based ink. They also have quite a large number of stylus tablets. These are the thicker pieces of wood in which there's a recess in which you put wax. So those are also important, but they're much more difficult to read because the wax doesn't survive. And so the scribe has to have written quite hard into the wax to leave faint marks on the wood underneath. So they're not so well studied. So what we've all talked about are the ink tablets. So I hope that answers your question, Esther. And as I say, there is a link which is going to be provided in the chat, where you can learn more. The next question is anonymous, and it's actually for me. Well, I'm not sure if I should take this, although I'm quite happy to try and answer it. What was in it for the Romans, and why were they interested in Britain? Well, yeah, I mean, this is a huge topic, but obviously there are countless reasons why that the Romans decided to add Britain to its empire, but primarily for Claudius, it was a propaganda exercise, and he needed a military victory to kind of legitimize his power. And as David mentioned, the army primarily is all about keeping those emperors in place. And so that's a big factor in why Claudius decided when he did to launch the invasion of Britain, although recent research, interestingly, suggests that this was the culmination of some years of planning before it actually occurred under Claudius, which is a very interesting thing. And then we learn from the sources that Britain was known to be rich in resources. And one of the very interesting things is that one of the very first areas that they went towards was the west of Britain, where there was lots of mineral resources, particularly lead and silver and gold, and they secured those sources quite quickly. So it rather gives us as echoes of the idea of exploitation of oil in different regions of the world, and those powers coming across. I hope Dave is hopefully nodding away and agreeing with much of what I have to say. But we also know that Britain did become a very important area for grain production as well, wheat production, and much of the wheat was exported from Britain to the Rhine and back into the kind of centre of the empire. So, I mean, there's a lot more to be said on this topic about what's in it for the Romans. David, perhaps you might like to come in here, but I was really struck by your map where you show so many military fortifications of Britain. It really feels almost as if Britain was a kind of dumping ground for troublemakers they were worried about. So they thought, well, let's stick them on the British island because it gives us a chance as they're across a piece of water to like, I do wonder if troublemakers were kind of put here. I mean the Roman army troublemakers.
Yeah. Well, in a sense, the Roman army, it's both the essential tool of the Roman Empire, emperors, but it's also a danger to them because, pretenders do arise from time to time. So one advantage of putting a lot of troops in Britain is that, they're across the sea from the rest of the empire.
But bought them a bit of time, didn't it?
They're not so easily mobilized into. But, the consequences of that for Britain are huge. Because that is a very, very high density of troops occupying this island. And, there are huge, implications from that about the extent to which, the regions where those forts are allowed to develop in a normal Roman way. These are regions that probably stay under martial law for 400 years, but best part of, just think about the fact of that.
Absolutely.
One of the things that's very striking about rural settlement in the north and west of Britain is how little it changes through those years of Roman occupation. That to me suggests these are societies whose capacity for surplus production is being pretty much scraped off all the time, constantly,
because there's no obvious signs of massive economic development. That's right. So that actually leads quite nicely into the next question from Karen, which is, would a military assignment to a frontier fort be considered a prestigious posting or banishment to a backwater? Emma, do you want to come in on that?
I mean, I honestly don't know the answer. I suppose it's going to depend on the person as to what they feel about being, they're people we know from the evidence that people come from all over the place and they move places constantly. They're moving in and out of different places. Vindolanda, for example, is rebuilt 4 or 5 times because a different legion or a different cohort moves in constantly, and they are always on the move. They're not so it's going to depend on whether you're like, oh good, this is a relatively peaceful place where we can stay and we're just going to be dealing with little Britons, or if you're going to be wanting to be on a somewhere that you can be fighting more brutally, more constantly, and plundering and getting all of the good spoils of a good war, which you're going to get less often in Britain.
I mean, it's interesting. Going back to Vindolanda, the fact that the two units that we know best from there, the Batavians and the Tungrians, those regions of the empire haven't actually been part of the empire for very long. It's quite fascinating, this idea of this integration of different peoples into the kind of way of thinking about the army. So they're coming to Britain really only within about a century of themselves becoming part of empire, and I find that quite fascinating. And we also can do quite a lot with some of their military careers. There's one officer in particular that became very prestigious commander of a unit in Pannonia after Vindolanda. So we can actually trace, in some cases, some military careers, suggesting that perhaps they weren't the most prestigious of postings, but they certainly could lead on to very prestigious military careers, having served in Britain. I would bring you in here, David, but I think because we've got quite a lot of questions, we should perhaps move on, although by all means do say more about that question whilst we're answering the others perhaps. There's a question from Jonathan, which is there any evidence of Latin words entering the local languages, dialects, or vice versa? Now, this is a hugely interesting topic on which there's a huge amount of work being done. And I might refer you to a wonderful project called Latin Now based at Nottingham, which is a really brilliant project because it's actually completed now. But there's an awful lot of web resources if you Google Latin Now, and that's really looked at this whole business about how Latin is used in the provinces and how it blending with these local dialects and how they might have sounded and all those things. I mean, I can only give you one example really, which is the word cerveza, which is if you've ever been to Spain, you know that means beer. And that was the Celtic word for beer, and that's used in the Vindolanda tablets, which is really fascinating. So there are lots of examples of this, of those local words, and in things like curse tablets, which you find in places like Bath and Ely, you'll find lots of words which are local words which are being used in combination with Latin. It's absolutely fascinating topic, but it's perhaps too big for us to explore here. Do either of my colleagues want to comment on this question?
Yeah. Can I just jump in? And
yeah,
I mean,
sure.
I think most of the toponyms in Britain are British names. So for places, and that suggests, I think, the more or less ubiquity of British dialects in everyday use, which again kind of marks the army out as distinct in that for them they have this other language, lingua franca, that they're using within their communities. And these military communities, again, I described in one of my slides, I think, as a sort of, think of them as a biome. They're kind of these sort of insulated, rather different communities in these northern lands, where you will have a very high proportion of people who can speak Latin, and it's one of the passes to get into that community is you're going to need that facility. But Latin doesn't necessarily, or spoken Latin, written Latin practices, doesn't seem to spread very far into the surrounding rural communities.
That's right, exactly. Yeah, from the evidence that we have from writing and so on in those areas. Let's move on to this question, which is from Hannah. Is there any evidence for local religious practices being adopted by the Roman army in Britain? Well, there's quite a bit actually. David, do you want to comment on this? Shall I start? Or
you start.
Okay. There's some interesting local things that do happen. Whether you can call it local religious practices though is a bit of a more of a tricky one. We certainly get material culture evidence for what seems to be the adoption of what might be described as local deities, of which we know very little actually, because the native Britons and indeed much of the pre-Roman world, they left us very little in the way of writing. So it's very hard to really get to grips with this. But I mean, to give you an example, we have in Britain some really interesting material culture evidence, such as these horse and rider figurines, which are basically, they look like a version of Mars, but we believe them to be probably more of a local deity, which is militarized and therefore kind of gets kind of melded with the idea of Mars. So that's one example, because these figures turn up in a number of places in Britain. And then you get, it's not quite the same as the question is asking, but then you get certain gods and goddesses that appear, which again seem to become blended with the Roman ideas of gods and goddesses, such as, for example, Sununa, who was a local goddess, which was previously unknown until the discovery of the Ashwell hoard in Hertfordshire, and she seems to have been a deity associated with a local spring. And interestingly, dedications to her are using Latin forms of dedication to gods, but very much a local deity that previously was unknown. David, do you want to comment on this as well?
Yeah, I suppose just the only thing I would add is, if we look just at the military zone, say the Hadrian's Wall area, pretty much the only religious activity of the Roman period that we can really see is going on in these garrison communities. Soldiers and the civilians that are associated with them worshipping gods which have local names, but by rites that are in no way paralleled on the local settlements, the British settlements. So it's a colonial kind of adoption of local gods. If you're troops in garrison, of course you want the local deities that protect the water supply that you're going to be drinking, that protect the food supplies. You want them on your side, so you're going to dedicate to them. But is that adopting British religious practices? It's adopting the gods. It's almost conquering the gods. In fact, you conquered the people, now you've conquered their gods and you've taken them for yourself.
Yeah, indeed. That's obviously a hugely interesting area as well to explore. So let's move on to next question from Emily. And Emily asks, what, if any, Roman technology or expertise was adopted by the local Britons and carried on after the Romans retreated from Britain? Wow, pottery production is one that springs to mind. Certainly, the way in which you see pottery being copied using local clays is an interesting example, perhaps, of this. In terms of being carried after Romans left Britain, well, that's an interesting one. One thing you do get, again, I suppose it goes back to serving the system, doesn't it? The whole point of pottery production to a large extent is serving the needs of the military community and the army. So, that's one example where you're getting these industries that are developing, but really you can almost always link them to some kind of military use rather than, or supplying the urban centres, which is a kind of byproduct of the military as well. Do either of my colleagues want to comment on this one? Or should we move on?
To jump in?
Do you want to jump in?
No, good. That would have said exactly the same thing. Just a lot of the things that you see emerge, or like through that Roman period, exist to fulfill the needs of the Roman Empire. When it's no longer part of the Roman Empire and those needs are no longer there, people move their labor and move their time elsewhere to fulfilling their own needs instead.
Yeah, there's quite a steep drop off really after the end of the Roman period. It doesn't. One obvious example is things like coinage, which basically disappears for some considerable time after the Roman period comes to an end. David, do you want to comment, or should we move on to the next one?
Let me just.
A couple of minutes
the
left.
One thing I would say is you could also reverse that question and say, sometimes we have an assumption that technologies didn't exist in this primitive land of Britain until the Romans came on board. Well, actually, that's not true to an extent. There, Iron Age metallurgy, Iron Age ceramic production, Iron Age agriculture. These things were happening to a very high level, and they change. I think what we do see in the Roman period is much more mass production of consumer goods, consumer durables, if you like. But ultimately, quite a lot of the craft tradition that was there before Rome is diminished and changed through that conquest.
Indeed. So we've got two more questions, so we're going to do those. I think we're allowed to run over a little beyond our allotted hour. So Andrew asks, were the Britons mainly compliant with Roman rule, and was there resistance against them? We did talk a little bit about this. That tablet, which both David and I discussed, is a very, very interesting one, because it's a direct idea of a person who's been persecuted and is basically feeling aggrieved and is trying to get redress for that. That's a specific example. Unfortunately, for a lot of the rest of the evidence for this really is about comes from the sources primarily, and they're not very useful on this aspect because they're written from the very much from the Roman perspective. David, dare we mention the disappearance of the ninth and things like this, or do we not go down that road?
Well, let's not necessarily go down that route exactly, but I think one of the bits of the BM exhibition that I really did like was that fabulous recreation of the double burial of two murdered Roman soldiers in Canterbury. You know, and if these are braggart soldiers swaggering around, you know, making themselves quite unpleasant in society, you could imagine, you know, late at night in a dark alley, you know, sometimes, you know, people do get back at them. But those are, you know, the rare instances. The other thing that I think is another very striking, chilling exhibit is that crucified skeleton that's turned up fairly recently on a rural site in Britain. But you know, the military will quite often have been involved in such you know, such sort of capital punishment and such vicious capital punishments being inflicted.
Indeed, yeah, that's right. It's an extraordinary discovery. It's only one of two actual evidence for crucifixion that we have from archaeology, because of course it's a practice that we know was widespread, but archaeologically it's been incredibly difficult to trace. So as David says, that's an extraordinary thing to have found. Okay, let's finish on our last one, which is quite appropriate because it's about the end of Roman Britain, really. And it says, when did the Romans leave Britain and why? Well, okay, well, I mean, in terms of when, it was kind of in the early part of the 5th century. I mean, we have some literary evidence which kind of gives us a date around about AD 410, but it's not a very reliable source. We seem to start seeing things peter out in the early decades of the 5th century. As I mentioned earlier, things like coinage start to, well, basically disappear. There's no more coinage supplied to Britain after around about 407. And much of the army and the administration is withdrawn. Indeed, in an attempted kind of coup by the emperor, short-lived Emperor Constantine III, who was taking troops out of Britain. Why did they leave Britain? Well, that's kind of, again, quite a big question. David, do you want to come in on this? I mean, we should perhaps move on to the other part of the question. Well, were the Britons try and go back to native ways, or did Romans forever change the social landscape?
So Britain is always a very remote part of the empire. It's the most northerly territory that the Roman Empire occupies. It's the most northwesterly bit of the empire. So, you know, when the empire starts to kind of shrink and come under pressure in the 5th century for a variety of reasons, you know, it's you can see it's the harder bit of the empire to make a strong argument for maintaining. Once they stop paying troops in Britain, you know, things change fairly rapidly. Although, you know, it's clear that life goes on in many of the towns in Britain. I think the fact that the monetary supply is significantly disrupted. We also do seem to see a collapse of a lot of the production of the, you know, Roman style pottery and material culture fairly rapidly. And that again suggests that the military must have been a very significant customer for those industries.
Great. I'm going to stop you there, David. Thank you both, Emma and David, for really fantastic talks today. And I think it's been a great session. Just to finish up by saying thank you, of course, to all of the people that joined us today. And we hope you found this event stimulating and made you think about stuff. Perhaps go to the Legion exhibition again and rethink some of the things that you're looking at. And to add that the next event in this series is the City Lit Classics Day, War and Peace in the Classical World, which will actually be an in-person event on the 15th of June. basically during that day from 10:30 till 4:30. And if you look on the museum's website, you can find out more about that. And the last thing to say is that if you haven't seen the Legion exhibition, or if you want to revisit, it's going to be open until the 23rd of June. So get your tickets or use your membership again and go and have another look. And thank you very much for joining us this evening. Thank you.